The sixth and last major geographical move of the Old Testament is Babylon to Israel. Now, with the people being in slavery to the Babylonians, sometimes they would put Jews in high positions, the Jews that were maybe well established or more educated. And this is what happened with a Jew named Daniel. Daniel was placed in a high-ranking position in the Babylonian court. And you could argue that he is the one who leads the people during this approximate 70 years in slavery to Babylon. However, the Persians come and they conquer the Babylonians. The Persians allow the Jews to return to Israel. And once again, there are different arrows coming from Babylon back to Israel. This is to point out that the trip back to Israel was not done all at once. There are at least 3 groups that make trips back to Israel at different times. The first group was led by a man named Zerubbabel. Zerubbabel was a prince of Judah. Almost 85 years pass before the next large group comes with the priestly scribe, Ezra. Another 15 years pass, and then Nehemiah leads a group back. You should also note that some of the people remained in Babylon. Israel had been destroyed, so to return to the promised land, to return to Israel over here, was challenging. It was difficult for people to live. It was like living on the frontier during the 1800s in the in the western part of the United States. So as a result, some stayed in Babylon. Now, when you include the group that is in Babylon and the group that went with Jeremiah to Egypt, and then this new group that's trying to rebuild the community in Israel, you now have 3 Jewish communities in 3 different places in the ancient Near East: Egypt, Israel, and Babylon. And so this move from Babylon to Israel is finished. What have you learned about God's nature from this move? One insight we can gain from this move is the power and control that God has. He has so much power that he can move a foreign power, the Persians, to conquer the Babylonians, just so that his people can return home. That is a powerful God. Another insight we can gain is that the rebuilding of Israel after it was destroyed by the Babylonians took a long time. It took 3 groups bringing people back to rebuild this place. And sometimes when we make bad decisions, the consequences are not easily undone. However, with persistence and faith, God can restore even the worst of situations. So are you in the midst of a move that requires persistence and faith? God has not forgotten you and is working to rebuild what was broken in your life and in the lives of those around you. But it's going to require some trust and persistence. Are you willing to do that? What other insights can you gain from this passage and from this geographical move? So once again, here are the 6 major geographical moves of the Old Testament. Number 1, you have Eden to Ur, and then Ur to Israel, and then Israel to Egypt, Egypt back to Israel, Israel to Babylon, and Babylon back to Israel. Now remember, by learning these moves in sequence, and why each move was made, the circumstances surrounding the move, and how the move fits into God's overall plan, you can tell a basic history of the Old Testament from beginning to end. Now, our last item of business is to return to our basic timeline of the Old Testament and to ask the question, can you place the 6 geographical moves on this basic timeline? Let's start with the first, Eden to Ur. Where does that fit on our timeline? Now remember that Eden to Ur goes from Adam and Eve all the way to Abram or Abraham in Ur. Because it ends with Abram, everything happens before 2000 BC. What about Ur to Israel? Where does that fit? The story of Ur to Israel is the story of Abraham being called by God to go to the place God would show him and where he would become a blessing to all nations. Therefore, the move comes after 2000 BC. But what about Israel to Egypt? Where does that fit? Now, Israel to Egypt is the story of Joseph being sold by his brothers, taken to Egypt, and eventually becoming second in command to Egypt, and moving his whole family to Egypt. Everything happens after Abraham, but before Moses. So we're sometime between 2000 and 1500 BC. Well, what about Egypt to Israel? Where does that fit on our timeline? Egypt to Israel is the story of Moses leading the people out of Egypt, the wilderness wanderings, and then the conquering of the Promised Land. The move begins with Moses, so we are after 1500 BC. But what about Israel to Babylon? Where does that fit on our timeline? Now remember, Israel to Babylon follows the story through the Judges and Kings period. The people turned away from God, and God eventually brought the Babylonians to take the people into slavery. The move occurs towards the end of the King's period. So it occurs between King David's time at 1000 BC and the exile around 500 BC. So we're somewhere in between. But what about Babylon to Israel? Where does that fit? The move of Babylon to Israel is the story of the people coming back from exile, coming out of slavery back to Israel. So it's got to be after the exile period. Now I should point out once again our initial dates for Abraham, Moses, David, and the exile period are approximate. However, I am not so much concerned about you getting the precise date for these geographical moves. I just want you to be in the ballpark, to have a general idea of when events happen along the timeline. The specifics will come soon enough as we study the Old Testament. Now, what insight have you gained into God's character from this snippet? How does God want you to respond to the moving phase that you currently find yourself? I hope that you have found at least one insight into how you can manage the stress of your current move. Well guys, that is where we're going to finish this session. We've covered a lot of ground, but hopefully this video will help you to review. I will see you guys next time when we study the Old Testament from 35,000 feet.